Welcome to Our Voices. I have a special guest on this very special day, on the eve of the big rally for tomorrow for Black Voters Matter. I have Miss Jennifer Wells with me. Jennifer, how are you doing today?
I am doing good. It's busy. You know, if anyone who's ever planned an event, the run up to that moment that it actually happens is crazy, crazy. And I'm going to say this, let me just name this. There is a whole host and team of people, both from West Virginia and outside of West Virginia, that have come together to throw down and make certain that tomorrow is special. And so I know in my heart and in my spirit, I'm excited. So I think that's that's the energy that's carrying me through right now. I am so excited to be out at that Capitol complex tomorrow at 5 o'clock.
I can tell you're much more than ready. You're much more than ready.
I stay ready, or at least I try.
There you go. Hey, before I go to my questions, please give the viewers a little something about Jennifer Wells.
Certainly. So I'm Jennifer Wells. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Huntington, West Virginia. I've been in Huntington for the last 16 years. And I work for a national organization, Community Change Action, which is headquartered and based out of DC. And for folks who may not know who Community Change is, it's a national social justice organization that's been around over 50 years, since 1968, that focuses on building power in low-income communities, and in particular, building power with low-income communities of color. The specific team that I work on that I'm so proud to be representing is the reinvestment team, and my team specifically supports Black-led organizations across the country to build power and capacity to do this work. And so that's my grounding. Now, I live in West Virginia. I'm not originally from West Virginia. Originally, I'm from New Orleans. I've been here for 16 years. And folks may know me from the work that I've done here in West Virginia. I've been in social work. I've been out in the field. I currently hold the board president of the National Association of Social Workers West Virginia chapter title. At one point in time was the ED of Our Future West Virginia, but I moved on last year to Community Change. So I've been around the whole state. I've been doing all the work. I've seen all the sites, or at least most of them.
So that is a 3-page resume right there.
Thank you. You asked for an intro. I can't help it. I gave you all of it.
You gave it to me. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I have some questions to ask you. Let's start with the first question. What is the current state of voting rights in West Virginia?
So that's a mixed bag, right? So like folks who have been hearing about the voting rights fight, in particular the fight to pass the federal legislation HR1 and S1, have heard about all the difficulties and the trials and tribulations that folks have getting to the polls. So West Virginia is not great. It's not the worst, but it's still not great, right? We have folks can vote, can register to vote, once they turn 18. You can typically do it at the DMV, but a lot of the provisions that we would like to see that would open the path for more democracy and more civic participation, we kind of saw that door opening last year with COVID. Right. So when COVID hit and the pandemic was in full swing, and folks know that, being in person at the ballot, or, having to vote in person or work the polls was just not the best option. And so the Secretary of State opened the doors and allowed folks to request an absentee ballot without actually having to have an illness or an unknown reason that they wanted to vote in that way, right, through the absentee ballot. They opened the system worked, it worked well. The folks that wanted to use it were able to use it. The folks that still wanted to vote in person were still given that option. Now, one of the things that West Virginia has that we would like to see change, those of us that want to see voting rights open for the masses and to be just a little bit more acceptable or more accessible, let me say that right, more accessible, is to have a no excuse absentee ballot, right? I shouldn't have to get a doctor's note. I shouldn't have to, particularly in a rural state. I mean, that's the one beauty of being in social work and having driven across the state. I know the terrain of, let's say, a Boone County, and how hard it is to get up from up a holler down to what could possibly be a polling location at the post office or the library or wherever it's set up. Like, for folks without reliable transportation or mobility would have issues getting into a polling place. So being able to vote in the comfort and the privacy of your home, being able to send that ballot in, but being able to access that ballot as you need it and saw fit is something that we don't currently have available to us. I mean, it opened the door in COVID, but it's not readily available. We have a voter ID law. I mean, honestly, you have to show some sort of ID in order to prove who you are when you vote. We have, I work the polls. I think anybody and everybody should at some point in time work at the polls for an election to really get the experience and really get to understand the inner workings of an election. So, right, you know the hardship of a 12-hour shift, you know the hardship of just like, what is it like to be at the poll and checking people in? And so I know that West Virginia has a part of their law that if folks may not have a photo ID with them, that they can bring some sort of identifying marker to the polling place, and if the poll worker knows them, then the poll worker can basically sign an affidavit and say, hey, I know who this person is, I can verify this, and then allow them to vote. But what that does is put it in the hands of people, and people are human and people are fallible, right? And so having to prove who you are, but then leaving the door open for someone else to say yay or nay as to whether you are that person, depending on the type of identifying information or materials that you bring to the polls. Or if you don't have that material, this person can speak up and say that they know you and therefore you're okay. But the next person that walks in, they may not know. So therefore that person doesn't have the same access and the same ability to vote. It's questionable, right? And so again, we have a voter ID requirement here in the state. It isn't the worst, but it's still not good. So I think that to me is the kind of like in a nutshell what it's like to vote in West Virginia. We can do a whole lot better. And let's not even talk a whole nother aspect of this is who doesn't have the right to vote, who doesn't have the right to request a ballot, who doesn't have the right to actually vote. And those are our folks that are incarcerated. Those are our folks that are or just in a holding pattern, right? They don't even have a conviction hanging over them. They don't have any sort of felonies, and yet they're denied their right to participate civically. There was some other aspect that I wanted to bring up, and it's like, it'll come back to me. It'll come back to me.
Okay. Now, next question. Please define or debunk the myth of Black voters matter with a pop. Okay, yeah. Please define, debunk the myth of Black voters matter.
So what's the myth part of it? Because we do matter. Everybody matters, and Black people matter too. So what's the myth part that you want me to debunk?
Just you go for it.
Yeah, go for it. So I'm assuming that folks may not feel that it's important to have an organization that is specifically seeking and organizing and mobilizing to build the voice of Black community. And I know that I've faced this type of resistance in some regards when folks that I am friends with, folks that I've worked with, have been pushing for the passage of the Crown Act across the state. So folks have often said, why do you need a law to protect your hair? And what typically is at the base of that is either an intentional misunderstanding or a genuine misunderstanding of just how policies work and just how many barriers exist for Black people in America and other communities in America. I mean, it can be across class lines, or it can be an economic question, but definitely this country was formed on racism, right? And that's a construct. And that everything that has folded out from the inception of this country and the way that power was laced throughout our laws have denied Black community, Black identifying community, the rights to fully participate as full citizens in this country. And so it's because of, yes, laws created hundreds and hundreds of years ago that still have an impact on the way that we're able to move and live our lives right now, is the reason why so many organizations are in existence to fight and to help other folks in community to build their voice. What may seem strange to some, because I know folks tend to think that like the civil rights era and even the era of enslavement are generations and generations past us or behind us, when I can tell you that in my house, my mother, born in the mid 40s, didn't get the right to vote at the same time that I got the right to vote. Like I was able to register to vote, and as a youth graduating and in New Orleans, as a part of my senior year, right? They came to my school. I was able to sign my registration forms. Everything was processed for me. My mother would have to wait until she was in her mid 20s because legally she didn't have the right to vote. And we were raised and lived in the Deep South, where even when you were granted the right on paper, right? You can have a law on paper, but words on paper are not actions. And to actually implement the process by which people can fully participate in picking who their senators are, who their state legislators are, who their city council person is, who their dog catcher. Everybody loves that joke. He'd run even for dog catcher. You know, I have a right to pick who I want to be my dog catcher. As a former dog owner, I'm concerned as to who is running this office and who is using these funds. And let's face it, political office is often attached to funds. Policy is also attached to our economic life. And so when I'm not able to pick or select or be a part of selecting the person that will dictate how I'm able to exist in my own neighborhood, then we have a problem. But we also know historically, whether it be West Virginia and other parts of this country, that we have not had, as Black people, the full right through implementation, through policy, through words on the paper, through constitutional amendments, the right to fully participate. Now, they don't seem to have that same problem collecting my tax dollars, but they do seem to have that problem allowing me to check a box on a ballot. So yes, the reason why Black voters matter and it's not Black, and it could be Black taxpayers matter too. But the reason why it's Black voters matters is it's always that one significant piece of our rights as citizens to fully participate in our government, to fully participate in our community, that always seems to be just one step away from us, right? It's like, yes, you can vote, but the poll tax of old, right? So first, in order to vote, you can't tell me how many pennies are in this jar. And of course, you can never count that. You're never going to get that answer right. So therefore, if you never get that answer right, even though you may have a voting card in your hand, you're not allowed to enter. The same goes for folks that register that may have difficulty coming and finding IDs, being able to pay for IDs. As a social worker, I worked with a number of families across West Virginia that I don't think a great many people who are privileged enough to have access to these documents or access to these systems or these services understand how hard it is to actually acquire an ID. I can say as a transplant, for me and my brother, who came with IDs from Louisiana, who once we had decided we're going to make West Virginia our home, we're going to make Marshall University our education institution. So we were staying, right? We were rooted. We were renting a house. We had an address. I went to the DMV on a bus no less than 4 times before I came away with my ID that I could then show to a pollster, or a poll worker in order to vote. Now that was for 4 separate occasions, usually no less than an hour, going both ways on the bus, taking time away from a job, taking time away from class, taking time away from other things that I may have needed to do for my own existence, including going to the grocery store and getting food. All of those attempts failed until the final 4th attempt for me to walk away with an ID. And they're saying that unless I have this ID or proof of some way that I'm a resident of this house, that I can't participate in my local government or in my state government or federal government. So the reason that organizations like Black Voters Matter, the reason that we say Black Voters Matter, is because we have to continue to say it, because sometimes it just never seems to be accepted. It never seems to be accepted by those that need it to be accepted. So I hope that helped in debunking a little bit.
You know, take into consideration, Jennifer, the Voter Rights Act began in 1965. Between 1965 and we'll say 2016, in your opinion, has there ever been a time where there have been a discrepancy when it comes to voting? The only other 2 times I can think of was the 2000 election with Bush and Gore, and the 2004 with Bush and Kerry. Something real minor. But now, the 2020 election, again, we woke up. We went to the polls. And what I find is so alarming is, in years, African Americans didn't really go to the polls to vote, even though they were registered voters. But now, again, it seemed like Black folks came out the woodwork and they cast their ballots. And now all of a sudden, there's all this backlash as far as taking away the voting rights for Black folks. You can't do this, you can't do that. Unfortunately, in Georgia, you can't give someone a water or something to drink while they stand in line. You can't do this. I mean, you can't drop off someone else's mail-in ballot. So many obstacles out there right now. Of course, the legislature here had their issue of trying to suppress the vote, which is real crazy.
I want to. Oh,
ahead.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I want to talk. Just make a comment around both perceived voter apathy in the Black community. There's a lot of research that is out there, and while numbers may show, I think that we had great numbers of folks. So there's definitely an increase in an influx of new voters, perhaps, or actually registered voters that showed up at the polls or mailed in ballots, which also was proof that the absentee balloting works, right? That when perhaps access was a reason that folks couldn't go to the polls prior. But I also just want to name that Black community believes in this right? That there may be times when the numbers aren't like blazingly high, but on a consistent basis, the Black community has always historically consistently participated as basically allowed. And suppression comes in so many barriers. Suppression comes from the Wheeling community in the fact that the polling station that's designated for those that are largely in the largely Black neighborhood is at the courthouse, where you have to go through metal detectors, right? That you have to go through a security guard. So while it's not like out and out, like, don't come here to vote, there's so many ways in which barriers are presented to us and to our community. It's when polling places, which happened in Georgia, and I'm sure has happened here in West Virginia, it happens all across the country, where polling places are established and then all of a sudden they're not staffed, or they move, or they're just not, resurrected in the neighborhood at every election. And so that in its own way, moving polling places or eliminating polling places, that's a form of voter suppression. The way that the voting dates are set up, I mean, people may not want to think about it, but that's why so many folks are pushing for a federal holiday, in particular when it comes to federal elections. Who works low-paying jobs more than communities of color? And low-paying jobs typically have erratic work schedules. And so you can't always assure that you will have the time off for early voting, which sometimes happens only on certain days on Saturdays or only during certain hours during the weekday. If you work shift work, you're not gonna be able to make those hours, right? And if a federal holiday lands on a day where you're supposed to report to work, you have to make a choice. Do I participate electorally, or do I miss a paycheck? And when paychecks pay for food and rent, and we know how hard it is to get that, I mean, that makes a very hard decision. And Black people are about survival. If there's one thing that we know in this community, and in this country, is that we know how to survive. And sometimes survival took on priority to participating in the electoral process, right? So again, these are where doors are open for us, and where opening our eyes to the ways in which voter suppression manifests. Historically, and I could possibly get these numbers wrong, so anybody that's watching that wants to correct me, please know that I am open to this. But I believe when slavery ended and we were first given the right to vote, if you go and you look at the results of elections that happened in the Deep South, where we had concentrated population, we were voting to the tune, Black, formerly enslaved community members and free members of color, we were voting to the tune of 98 to 100% every time. There is great study in academic research that even showcase how lynchings across the Deep South, if you overlay the map of lynchings in high concentration and the map where voter suppression, voter engagement by the Black community shrunk decade after decade, you will see how they match up. Violence in the 40s and the 50s was a political ploy, right? It was meant to keep us away from the polls. You were going to die if you voted. So what did you choose? You chose to live and fight another day. And that's violence still exists when it's around the polls. We see it in other countries. We don't always want to identify. It's a little uncomfortable to have to identify it in our own country because we're the land of the free, right? We don't want to say that we look like Beirut. We don't want to say that we look like a third world, quote unquote, third world country where elections are always an iffy situation for people participating and might even be a situation that ends in violence for those that want to seek their right to participate civically. But it happens here in this country, right? People are harassed at the polls, people are threatened, and people sometimes stay away because of that threat. But I want to give my community credit in the sense that we show up when asked. I know there is always a lot of rhetoric around election time, around Black people, you need to register to vote, and Black people, you need to show up. And I just want to give us a little bit credit. We do. We show up. Now we can show up in greater number, and that's what we're seeking to do, and we're seeking to infuse. Don't give up. Don't give up hope. Even as these laws are being passed, right, where they always want to change the finish line. So as you said, in 2020, we showed up, we rose up yet again. Those that have been consistently voting, always consistently voted, and then a new crop came on. And the opposition said, oh no, they actually have the power to move and to move us out of power, right? They have the ability to take power away. And so we need to make certain that that doesn't exist for them anymore. And that's why you see a surge of legislations across the country that are doing in its own minute ways to the biggest ways, making certain that it becomes a little bit more difficult for folks to participate. We showed our power. We have to continue to show our power. We have to continue to stand in our voice. But yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
Jennifer, with a population rate of 3.4% of African Americans in West Virginia, what other factors could happen should voter suppression come into play here in West Virginia?
We have a small overall. So speaking to the number, this is something I fought a lot when I worked entirely in the state with organizing, community organizing, doing some electoral organizing. We were always running across that number, and that number speaks volumes as far as discouragement, right? So when you say I'm only 3.4% of the population, or I'm 6% of the population, taken in a whole, taken as a state, it feels like, well, what does my vote really matter? At the end of the day, can we move anything? And I, again, am apologizing for not having all of my credits ready for this question, but someone spoke to the fact that in all actuality, it only takes 2% of a population to start a revolution. So 3% to 6% in West Virginia, Black community, there's still enough numbers to move. There's still enough numbers to have impact. And then when you break it down a little bit more, which is one of the first things I did when I moved to the state, coming from a largely Black city of New Orleans, always being in great number with my community, I wanted to find, I'm like, I know where Black people are, there's typically a concentration of Black people. So where in West Virginia do Black people live? And it was very easy to find that I was living in one city, right? So I lived in Huntington. I came to Charleston on a regular basis. I could obviously see with my eyes open that Charleston had a Black community. Going into Beckley, then doing a little bit of research and finding out how many Black folks are existing and living in the southern part of the state. And then digging a little bit deeper to find out that there are actually portions of this state, which is something that I've told folks nationally, before you discount West Virginia, and certainly before you discount Black West Virginians, understand that we live in areas where we can have immense political impact locally, and then transition that power other places. And so the first place that I looked, and I've been dying to work personally, is in Bluefield, West Virginia, where there's a population of about 20% Black, right? And so like a 20% Black population in a concentrated area, when organized, when mobilized, when participating civically, can have a definite impact in their part of this, in their city, in their part of the state. And then that can actually be the energy that moves over. But I know a lot of folks are discouraged when they see small numbers, but real change doesn't have to happen at the 97 percentile. Real change happens in small incremental ways with organized groups of people. Right. What can voter suppression do? It's meant to keep us at home, right? It's meant to have us not participate. It is meant for us not to lean into our full power, right? Here I sit in Huntington, West Virginia, and one of the great things that happened in the 2020 election that didn't get, a lot of press, nobody was really concerned about it, was my little neighborhood, Fairfield West, which is the largely and predominantly Black neighborhood in Huntington, historically Black neighborhood, have a city council race, right? Our city council seat was up. And a woman who has leadership here because she was the child care provider for a large part of my community, threw her name in the hat and said, I want to be the city council person. Well, here, this is somebody that lives 3 blocks away from me. This is somebody I talk to regularly. You know how much power you have when you actually can call on the phone or walk across the street or walk down the street and talk to the person that is going to be at the seat that can decide how your streets get paved, how your infrastructure is improved, how your neighborhood is improved, how your home gets valued. We had this person running for office. Not only that she was a Black woman who lives in our neighborhood, she was a Black woman we knew. And what happened with her candidacy and the power of voting and the power of the Black vote was her candidacy brought to surface a number of people. And I'm talking about the mothers and the families that she supported and she helped as a child care provider, are often the folks that are ignored politically. These are the people that are not engaged. These are the people that are not sought out. These are the people that are not, their neighborhoods are not canvassed. Their housing developers are not canvassed for normal political elections. We don't see, I'll just say this name this quite clearly. We don't see politicians in our neighborhood, right? While politicians are holding rallies or holding canvassing, door knocking, or they're doing town forums, they don't come to my neighborhood, right? Because what they say is, oh, when you look at data, they don't tend to vote, which speaks to both groups, right? It speaks to us as a community that that's how we get labeled, right? And then that's how we're diminished in the eyes of decision makers. They don't vote. If they don't vote, we don't really need to listen to them, because even if we disappoint them, how are they going to unseat me? They're not coming to the polls to vote me out. But then for politicians, it's a whole wealth of people that you just ignore because you figure it's not worth it to talk to them. It's really not worth it to engage them because what's it gonna amount to? Well, Teresa knew who her base was. She knew that she had a natural base of mothers and children for a couple of decades that she had cared for, that trusted her, that knew her heart, that knew how hard she would work for them. She was able to engage a whole new group, get them registered, let them understand the process of the campaign, and really get them engaged as to what she was running for, right? What does a city council person really do? And so she was able to talk to them about how she would impact their daily lives, much more than their delegate that represents them at the House, much more than the congressional person that may or may not have sent a flyer to their house as they were running for office, even much more than the senator that's getting all the attention right now. As a city council candidate, she had more sway over their day-to-day life than anyone. When she had these moments with a base that had never been engaged before, guess what? They knew her, they trusted her, they became engaged. She not only won her election, she won it pretty soundly, right? By the tune of maybe 400 or 500 votes. But what I saw when I read that news was those are 500 people that probably had never entertained politics, right? It's messy. You don't even know what the point of it is. Yeah, I don't know if my vote even matters. I'm not even sure my voice matters. Here we have a councilwoman that now knows you as a person that you can speak to about what you need done in this city, that can actually have the pull and the power and the access and capacity to get change made. And so here we've engaged a whole nother community in Huntington, right? Just in little old Huntington that had not been engaged prior. They were part of that uptick that you probably saw written about the 2020 election, but guess what? They weren't engaged on the federal level. They didn't care about the presidential campaign. They were engaged because they were getting and seating someone they trust and they know into city council and into office. And so I I know the number exists. I know people will always speak about the percentage, but I always want to infuse the conversation with folks that it doesn't take a great mass of people. You don't have to fill a football stadium to see change. You just have to participate consistently. And there are ways to do it. And as long as you understand what it means, what the outcomes can mean, and how to do it, you can get folks engaged. You can get them excited. So I hope that I answered the question, but I get really passionate when folks start talking about that little bitty number of Black people in West Virginia and how we may or may not matter to the rest of the state.
Well, a lot of people don't realize is 3.4% of 1.6 million is roughly between 57 and 60,000. And you look at the 2018 election, Joe Manchin beat Patrick Morrisey by 17,000 votes. And it is believed that of the 17,000, 15,000 came out of Kanawha County, which is predominantly Black. And look what he's doing today.
Yes.
Crazy, isn't it?
Crazy.
Next question. Here's a pretty interesting question right here. Pretty interesting. Some poor white folks have this notion that it's all good here and it doesn't affect them here in West Virginia. Please explain the myth and how voter suppression will affect them.
It's residual, right? So even if the target is not the community that feels that everything is okay, residually, you will be impacted by it no matter what. When it becomes harder for folks to vote, when it becomes more difficult for you when you show up to the polls to be able to proceed to a real ballot and not a provisional ballot, which once I worked the polls, I realized how worthless a provisional ballot really was, right? If you were in the wrong precinct and they couldn't find your name, then they were like, oh, well, yeah, we can't let you, like, you can't vote on this regular ballot. Let's give you this provisional ballot. And it looks just as official, right? So people fill it out, they put it in the envelope, they give it back to the poll worker, and then it goes in a box. That's what I learned as I worked the polls, which was an eye opener, right? And that box doesn't get touched unless things are so close and so narrow and so undecided, like it's such a tight race, that then they say, let's pull the provisionals and see if that will push it over. But if that doesn't happen, right, if that scenario doesn't actually occur, then provisional ballots are basically just left in the box. They're tossed, right? They don't mean anything. And everybody that had the conviction to go to the polls, physically walking, because this was a physical election that I experienced this in, why would I go through all that trouble not to have my vote count at all? But in that regard, if we're looking at it as a race class issue, the folks that I filled out provisional ballots when I was a poll worker, they weren't Black. And yet, because these laws are situated in the way that they are, right? That they are meant to target a certain group, to suppress a certain vote, in all actuality, it was all white people's votes that were in that box that were not going to be counted. So in essence, it harmed them too. They actually didn't count in that election. When folks, same as with the Black Lives Matter, we are calling attention to injustice. And if injustice is touching one of us, don't believe it stops at me. Like, it's going to skip me once it's done with me, and it's going to go on to the next person. It knows no bounds. And so the idea is, where there are issues in the rest of this country, it is felt, is trickled down. You may not feel it directly or personally on a day-to-day basis, but understand, if there is oppression happening in this country with racism, with economics, with voting suppression, everyone is impacted in some way, shape, or form. No one gets to escape the consequences of wrongdoing. No one gets it. And so I say to the folks who say that we're fine, we're not. We're not. And the fight that is happening right now is indeed for everyone. When I am fighting for voter suppression laws to be removed or not to be implemented or to be voted out or strike down, I'm not doing it by race or by party. I'm saying everybody has a right. I mean, if you vote for the opposition, you have every right, as I do, to walk to the polls and make sure that your vote counts. And if you have the greater number and your candidate wins, that's a fair election. That's all we're saying. We want everybody to have free access, whether you are in a nursing home, whether you're away overseas as in military, whether you have transportation issues and you can't get to the polls on any given day or any given time to vote. you still have a right to participate. If you are incarcerated and they have the audacity to count you as a body so that their census numbers can be awarded and those census dollars can be awarded, but in the same breath, I'm saying you as a human being have no right to decide who governs you. Come on now. Come on.
Jennifer, I have a couple more questions. The other day, I was on a Zoom meeting call. Sammy Brown, I've never met her. She made mention about the anti-protest law.
Mm-hmm.
Please explain the current status of the anti-protest law and how it will affect this state if it's passed.
So I'm gonna beg a little bit of ignorance on this state side, and I only say that because I've had to work outside of West Virginia for the most part of this year and last year. So I'm not quite certain where the anti-protest law is in the West Virginia terms. But what I know about the anti-protest law is, okay, so let's look at it. George Floyd is murdered. The nation erupts. We are no longer tolerating. We will no longer tolerate injustice that we have witnessed in that 8+ minute clip. We're taking to the streets. We will not accept injustice. We are taking to the streets across race, across gender, across class. Majority of the folks identify as Black because we have known this oppression firsthand for generations. If I am out in the streets protesting an injustice, something that I believed was my right by the Constitution, my right to disagree with my government and to peacefully protest. Anti-protest law, and again, folks can correct me, is not making a differentiation between violence. I don't care in that regard, but it's not really making a differential between anti-violence or violent or non-violent protests, right? Let me get that straight. But if you're out in the streets and you get charged for protesting, what's the first thing they take away from somebody that's charged? Doesn't have to be convicted, simply charged. You have a charge hanging over your head. They're waiting to see how it's all going to end. One of the first things that's stripped from you is your right to vote. So
that's crazy. Yes, it's crazy.
If you're protesting, your right to speak out as an American in exercising one right, this law is seeking to take away another and a more profound right, right? Here we got 2022 coming up. It's a major election year on all levels. You're gonna have states, you're gonna have local, but you're gonna have federal elections. If you can decrease the voting population that is so active that they are currently in the streets telling you what they don't like, then hopefully you can start to sway the results in your way. So I believe that's why these laws are popping up. And at first, folks, and I get it, right? Particularly with West Virginia and the teachers' strike. You know, here it is, they're talking about taking away their pay. So that's a whole nother silencing, right? You don't have a right to tell us that you don't like how you're being treated in your job, whether it be the financial part or the work environment or the culture. You have no right to tell us that, right? Again, you must be silenced. But then here's the extra threat above that, right? Not only do we not want you talking, but if you dare to say something, we're going to take away your pay, which is your ability to feed your family, clothe yourself, house yourself. But then most importantly, if you look deeper, we're also going to take away your right to decide. If you don't like who's in office and making these policies, you're going to have a damn hard time trying to unseat them and put somebody in that sees the world and values the same things that you value. So that's my take on all of the anti-protest laws, that it is another form of voter suppression. It is greatly it's greatly pushed because that is another way that they can silence a whole percentage of folks that have the right to say, I don't like what's happening, that have the right to say, I don't like how this government is governing. And I have a right to then go back to the polls and make certain that I can vote in the person that does. And maybe we'll win and maybe we won't win, but I have the right to at least exercise that. So that's my take generally on the anti-protest laws.
One last question. Right now, who should we as a state, who should we focus more our attention on? Who should we focus on more? Senator Joe Manchin or the state legislature?
So I work on all levels, and I'm going to say all of them. And I say all of them because they feed off of each other. So I'm gonna always say, and this is what folks don't find, like, and I'm gonna make this statement, in one of the most unsexy political roles that I feel exists is county commissioner. If you ask anyone, and I've done this, I've tested this, if you ask anyone across the board to name who their county commissioners are, they cannot name them. They cannot name them. They don't know how they get elected. They may not live, they don't know how long any of them have been in office once they find out who their names are. So here's this very powerful political office that controls a great amount of money that flows into your towns and municipalities, that is receiving money from the federal government. So how they work in tandem, one of the blessings that opened up this year has been the fact that so many resources have been able to flow down from the federal level. So why it is important to always keep your eye on who's in the federal level is because there's a lot of power and control that can flow down to your cities and states in the terms of dollars and how dollars and resources are distributed to your communities. As they flow down, we know that the governor can make decisions about where that money goes. That's how important that position is to your life, and that you have someone in there that shares your values and you trust. And then as this federal dollars skip the state in West Virginia, right? Now, I'm told Senator Manchin was a huge part of why American Rescue Plan dollars were actually funneling straight to the cities. So here, my city, Huntington, is getting $44 million. $44 million. And guess who has a say as to where that money goes? My mayor and my city council person. The same city council person that this Black community got in office is sitting in a position where she can determine how this money gets used in my neighborhood. So that's how important local people are. So always stay local, always. At the state level, we are fighting to make certain that our state budget is a just budget that is equitable and takes care of us, because money from the state flows to our schools, to our roads, and how it's distributed is who has the most pull in the ear of the people in power. So you always want to make certain that you're having some representation, you're having some say, you're being seen, you're being heard by the people that are at that level. But don't choose between the levels. Engage in organizations, engage in community together, and figure out how you can attack all of them. They all need to be watched. Every last one of them needs to be held accountable because they all talk to each other. They all work together. But what we're seeing at this moment, why we are so frustrated, why we're having such a hard time getting what we need, is because they're taking care of themselves, right? They're taking care of themselves and the people that may pay for their campaigns, or the people that have infused their ability to gain this power. And so they're answering not to those of us on the ground, they're answering to them. But in numbers and in voice, in consistency and solidarity, we can make enough noise that, Chase Bank or whichever entity is funding, or whatever business or organization is lobbying them the hardest, that they can never take their eyes off you. And that's at every level. You have to watch your senators, your congressmen, your governor, your state legislature, and also your mayors and your local municipal elected officials, because day-to-day life is handled at that level. And I've always found it, and I'm guilty of it too, not knowing who represents me at the level that I can actually touch. So my say is, there are going to be times where you're going to have to laser focus on one particular level of government, but always keep them in your purview, always keep all of them held accountable to how they're treating you. A line that I'm going to be using from now into memoriam was said on a panel discussion that I was blessed to be able to watch today. And the line the woman said was, Aisha Goins from Nevada. She said, watch where they spend their money. Watch where your government spends the money. They're telling you what they think of you. And once you realize what they think of you, go in and show them what you think of them. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry, I accidentally hit that. I'm sorry. I'm done. So I'm gonna give you one last minute, 1 minute, to tell folks about tomorrow.
So I'm excited about tomorrow. So tomorrow, Thursday, June 24th, from 5 to 7 p.m. Please come out from wherever you may be, if you're able, to the Capitol complex to join the Blackest Bus in America, Black Voters Matter, a national organization, is coming to show solidarity to Black voters and residents of West Virginia. While we're centering and lifting Black voices, every ally, every co-conspirator is also invited to join us. Tomorrow, we're going to have food. There's going to be music, because there's nothing that does not infuse culture. The Black community knows that wherever we are, and we are in numbers and we are in power, there's always our culture. We bring our whole community with us. So there'll be food, there'll be music, there'll be poetry, there'll be speakers. All for the majority of the speakers will be local leaders from West Virginia. And the biggest point about tomorrow is to stay and steadfast in this fight. We have got some disappointments. I know that for some, the vote yesterday at the federal level may have been disappointing, but it was not unexpected. And a good piece of advice that I was given as well about a week ago was, in most cases, you're going to lose as we battle for what we want, right? As we battle for what we need to thrive. We're going to stumble sometimes and we're going to lose, but we never give up the fight. And a part of what tomorrow is our ability as Black community in West Virginia to show the whole country we exist, and we are strong, and we got numbers, and we're ready to fight, and we're standing steadfast in our voice and in our power. It is going to be so special. Cliff Albright, Latasha Brown, if you watch MSNBC or CNN, you've seen them numerous times in the last couple months. Well, they are excited to join us. Right? They are excited to join us tomorrow to say that we stand in this together, that when West Virginia wins, when West Virginia's Black community and voters win, the rest of the country. A lot of what is happening to the country is happening because of who is in leadership in West Virginia. So we have something to say. West Virginia has something to say, and we're going to say it well tomorrow.
Hey, Jennifer, thank you very much for coming to Our Voices.
Thank you.
You take care, okay? Don't go anywhere, okay?